we next up on the panel, appreciate the question, Preston. Secular Muslim, I believe you as well. I think this is your first time here in an open mic, and therefore feel free to introduce yourself. Let us know what position you specifically hold to. And then if you had a question or a point for Kent or Jackson, go ahead.
Salam alaikum, everyone. Yes, I'm a former Christian of more than 10 years, Bible believing. I was a hyper literalist as well, but one simple fact for me debunked the literal reading of Genesis, and it's this. And so it's sort of a question or a statement, and Dr. Holman can give a rebuttal. Adam and Eve had just children, and then who did those children marry? According to Genesis, if we descended from a common ancestor, the only option would have been their brothers and sisters. And Dr. Ken Hovind said science is about observation and experimentation. Well, every experiment that we have of brothers and sisters having intercourse and having children, they develop incestuous children filled with genetic deformities. And so that would have been the end of the human race. So how do you get a literal Adam and Eve with incest? That debunks the entire narrative.
Actually, Kent, before you respond, brother, I just wanted to ask Secular Muslim a simple question based on that. What about the genome results in inbreeding related problems? When inbreeding takes place, what in the genome manifests that makes for these kinds of deformities and issues?
From my understanding, it just you develop the worst of each gene pool. But that's as far as I can go into it.
It's mutations, right? Mutations are manifested due to inbreeding, right? Inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. And so if you go back in time to Adam and Eve, or you go back in time to the pre-flood population, you wouldn't have very many mutations to come to the forefront to lead to those kinds of inbreeding related problems. So I think firstly, that's an issue you have. And if you have a response to that, save it. We'll hand it over to Kent now to get his response. But I did want to just point that out briefly. Kent, you are on mute, brother. Feel free to unmute and go ahead.
All right. Let's see. Secular Muslim. You said you used to be a Christian for 10 years. The scripture in Genesis chapter 5 is very clear. It says Adam was 130 when Seth was born. The Cain and Abel was before that. No dates are given. And then it says in Genesis 5, verse 4, and the days of Adam after he begat Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the 8 days of Adam were 930 years. How many kids could you have in 800 years? One every 9 months and 20 minutes. So you could have a whole lot of kids during that time. Yes, Adam and Eve's sons married their sisters. There was no other choice. There was no genetic load. There were no there wouldn't be any mutations yet. That came later. Adam married his own rib. So if you gave up Christianity for that question and accepted Muslim for that, you really jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. So think about it.
I have a response to that also. I get we're saying that Adam and Eve had a perfect genome or whatever, but then after the fall and then to the flood, you have another genetic bottleneck with Noah's 3 sons and their wives, which they would have had some mutations, and their offspring surely would have had some mutations. It was after the fall, it was after the flood. So
let me respond here. I don't know that they would have any mutations beginning at all until maybe after the flood, because they all lived in a perfect world. They're all living to be 900. Read Genesis chapter 5. The dates are all there. So everybody before the flood was probably doing just fine. Almost no mutations. That would come in after the flood, not after the fall necessarily. So I think after the flood, we would see this begin to start to happen, mutations. And you'd probably have, 8 or 10 generations where you could marry cousins. Even today, people marry first cousins. Sometimes there are no problems. Some states allow first cousin marriages. Most you have to be second cousin or more to legally get married in that state. But the point is, they're still male and female. They're still able to make a baby. And if there's a mutation, this is 6,000 years from the original event of the creation. So I don't think you could say we know there were mutations creeping into the gene code before the flood came. I think that there's a lot of reasons why we have mutations, and in biology class you can study all that. But the mutations are so minor and negative, as now you're trying to argue mutations are negative. A minute ago you were saying that's how we improve.
Well, I'm saying recessive mutations are negative, and inbreeding brings out recessive traits.
Right. I still want to see some beneficial mutations, maybe next debate, but
okay. Well, and Kent, as you were saying, there has to be recessive negative mutations to come to the forefront to lead to any problems with inbreeding. And so Adam and Eve wouldn't have had any recessive gene disorders of any kind. And if Noah and his family did, it would be very few, because the highest genetic load we currently have is today, after the flood, many years after the flood, I should say.
And our genetic load is constantly increasing. And humanity is getting generally sicker and generally worse off. Lots more problems happening today. There's hospitals in just about every major city. Well, you wouldn't need them for a long time. I think God created a perfect world. Man has destroyed it. And the idea of Adam and Eve children having to marry sisters is not a problem. And giving up Christianity for that reason, I think, is really, you need to think that through one more time. Brother, it's been 2 hours. I had to get up before breakfast. It was terrible this morning. So I'm ready to go.
I hope breakfast was good. Bacon, eggs, maybe some pancakes, brother. Start the day off right.
My wife can cook. Man, come on down. We'll feed you here at Dinosaur Adventureland.
I will, definitely. Okay, Kent, thank you for another 2 hours. We do have another one of these in another 10 days. So looking forward to it. Okay, Kent, God bless. And as Kent leaves, and we still have secular Muslim here, I would be curious to ask what his thoughts are on the responses provided to your challenge, basically, to the separate ancestry model that would, you were arguing basically that, Adam and Eve, and especially at the flood, Noah, his family, right? Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives, there would be an inbreeding problem. I was curious what your responses were to what we've said. Go ahead.
Sure. There was no scientific evidence given. He just claimed that there was no genetic deformity because everything was perfect. So he made a theological claim, but there was no science provided. Like there's no evidence of any creature on Earth ever in any fossil record of there being perfect genes or anything like that. That sounds like a mythical tale. So
Secular Muslim, yeah. Let me ask you a question. Just hypothetical. You can stay unmuted. I'd like for you to interact briefly, but let's just assume,
I'm here.
Let's just assume, if it is the case that God exists and the biblical creation story is true, would God create Adam and Eve with a perfect genome, or would God create them with a bunch of harmful mutations from the beginning? What do you think?
According to your hypothetical,
hypothetically, yeah. Hypothetically, if it is the case that God exists and the biblical account of creation is true, sure, would God have created Adam and Eve with the perfect genome?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And so, Jackson, let me ask you then, because you're an evolutionist, you're not a Christian, you disagree with our position, and you have some knowledge of genetics. I'll ask you the same question. If it is the case that God exists and God created Adam and Eve with the perfect genome, would inbreeding, at least from the point of creation, would that be a problem?
From our starting point.
Maybe not, but once we get to the flood, and then Shem, Ham, and whatever, Japheth, their children, they're probably going to be born with some mutations. And then we have a severe bottleneck.
I want to address, let me address that real quick, Sam, then you jump in. Okay. The reason why it's not an issue for the biblical creation model is because the flood would have been a 1-generation bottleneck followed up by rapid and exponential population growth. It is not analogous to the out of Africa evolutionary bottleneck where you have a prolonged bottleneck, a bottleneck that has a population of human beings remaining between 2 and 10,000 individuals for thousands of years. That is thousands of years of inbreeding and recessive deleterious mutations coming to the forefront and manifesting in rapid genetic degeneration. The biblical creation model doesn't have that problem. And to secular Muslim, you can see here, and this is well supported by the population genetics and just genetics in general, we have a growing genetic load. You can see here an average newborn contains 100 de novo mutations. That means we are accumulating roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation. And so it's not complicated to figure this out. You take 100 new mutations per person per generation today, take that back thousands of years ago, we would have a genetic load that is not as high as it is today. And as a matter of fact, take it back 6,000 years ago, and you have a created couple, Adam and Eve, with no mutations, and therefore no inbreeding problem. Go ahead, gentlemen.
I feel like we're getting into the genetic entropy range here. So I want to mention this paper I came across. It's called Springman et al. 2010, Evolution of a High Imposed Mutation Rate, Adaptation Observed, and Obscures the Genetic Load in T7 Bacteriophages. Basically, they introduced a mutagen into a population of these T7 bacteriophages, and they expected it to cause like lethal mutagenesis. But what actually happened with these is it caused an increase in fitness, and they actually reproduced more.
If
generations.
If you don't mind, secular Muslim, I hope you stick around. I would encourage you to. But I know Paul. Paul, welcome back. I know Paul, and I think Doc Dino wanted to have a brief little mini debate. Is that okay with you gentlemen?
Yeah, we can definitely hold off on what we were just discussing and allow Doc. So, Paul, I'm guessing you heard Doc. He had a response to you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, and that phage paper that Jackson just brought up is I'm assuming he got that from Dr. Dan because that's one of his favorites, and it's actually been addressed at creation.com/fitness. I went into quite a bit of detail on that paper since he likes to talk about that paper a lot. Now, go ahead.
Oh, that's why you're our champ here, brother. You've got it all covered.
Doc Dino, go ahead. You said you've uncovered the secrets of the paper. Before you
do, hold that thought, Paul. You got out of here last time. Before I wanted to acknowledge that your most recent article I read, and it was an excellent article. And the timing was perfect because a few days ago I was talking about Donny and suggesting that yes, the secular, they do have to give an account for the uniformity of nature. And I was showing him that I have papers from secular physics that are challenging these laws of nature and the uniformity of these things, suggesting that maybe the laws of physics have changed, maybe they're woven into space-time. Maybe Newton and Einstein are wrong, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with those. But even within the secular camp, they challenge that also.
Yeah, that sounds like the cutting edge stuff. I'm not really up on all of that, but I'm happy you read the article and that it was helpful. It was kind of distilled down from all of the work I did to actually do the presentation here on Donny's channel, and I even referenced some of the interaction that happened in the open mic after that presentation. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that before you left.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Carry on.
All right, Doc Dino, let's hear it.
So first, I wouldn't say I uncovered the secret or whatever.
Okay.
I just figured I'd look into your source. So I went to Mori et al. And the bit about them talking about uncrushed and unpermineralized bone is lifted from an earlier paper by a few different scientists, Gangloff and Fiorillo, which was basically an analysis of a bunch of fossils at this site in Alaska. And the thing is, I searched through this original article that this is from, and I can't
Yeah,
find
it's not there.
anything about
It's
the
not there.
permineralization.
It's not there because I would agree with you that the way that he included an in-text citation was a little misleading there, and I think that is ultimately what caused Fiorillo to come after him and attack him for it, because the way that Maury phrased it in the article made it sound like he was citing those other people as like they're the ones that said this, when in fact what he was actually doing is giving his own description, his own firsthand description of the bones. So I don't know why he put that in-text citation in there like that, because it is, I will agree with you that the way that was worded is misleading. But when Fiorillo came after him about it, he stood by his description. He said, I don't know if you probably didn't have, because you just looked at this, but if you read my article, you'll see that he did reply to the criticism. And the Maury said, he said, in our generalized description of bone preservation, we use the modifier typically in describing the degree to which bones are uncrushed and I think he's meant to say unpermineralized. We did not contend that bones are never crushed or permineralized. We recognize that the bones are ferruginous, iron-like in color, reflecting some degree of iron-bearing mineral infiltration, which technically can be categorized as permineralized. However, vertebrate paleontologists typically reserve this term for cases where mineral infiltration lines the vascular canals and trabecular spaces of bones and is visible macroscopically. We are aware that some bones in the Liscum bone bed exhibit this type of preservation, but maintain that it occurs in a surprisingly small, currently unquantified percentage of bones. We apologize for any confusion this may have caused.
Yep, I see it in your article. And
yeah, so they apologize for the confusing wording there, but they're standing by their description of the bones as being typically uncrushed and unpermineralized.
Well, unpermineralized by that definition, but they say right here that there is another. Sorry. Okay. So with the bones they're working with, they are, in a manner of speaking, permineralized, just not in the typical definition of the term.
Correct.
They are preserved in a different way, but they are still permineralized.
Well,
they're still fossilized.
If you read what he said, he made it clear that calling them permineralized is only technically correct, but in essence it's incorrect, and that's why they stood by their description, because all that they're observing is essentially a tinge of rust color on the outside of the bones. It hasn't turned to stone, it's not petrified, and it's not the mineralization has not infiltrated to the interior of the bone. And so
that's true.
So that means that you have original bone there. That is bone, not iron, not any other mineral. And that bone is now we're being asked to believe that bone has survived 70 million years without degrading.
I mean, it can.
Well, not according to science, it cannot.
No, it absolutely can. What's the mineral component of bone?
The only thing that holds the bone together is the bone collagen, and that has been tested. The half-life is known on that.
No.
If you take away the collagen out of the bone, it is going to turn into a pile of dust. You understand what collagen does, right?
Yeah, collagen is a form of connective tissue. But
yeah, it's holding the bone together. You can't have a bone without collagen.
you can have a bone without collagen.
Well, only if it's fully permineralized, which these are not. That's the point.
No. Okay. So, sorry. So what it seems like has been preserved is the mineral form of the bone. Now, you are right that they can sometimes crumble into dust if there is no collagen. However, these fossils would have been underground by that point. They would have been encased in rock or sediment. They wouldn't have been able to crumble to dust.
They've been
because they
excavated.
couldn't move.
They've been excavated.
They've been excavated millions of years later.
I know, but if you're trying to tell me that there's no collagen left in the bone, then you're going to have to explain why it isn't a pile of dust now, because it's been excavated. You can't say it's being held together by the surrounding sediment. It's been excavated. The collagen is still there. It has to be.
Didn't you say there was a bunch of ferrite in it also?
No, what they said is that there is a tinge of iron color on the exterior only, and that's it. That's what they're saying. It has not infiltrated into the bone.
So if the exterior is infiltrated by iron, that means that it has been infiltrated by iron, and the exterior is the shape of the bone.
Yes. How do you think that they know that the interior is not infiltrated? How could they possibly know that?
Well, probably
Obviously
either found
they've got a
broken
cross.
pieces or sliced it
Obviously they've
open.
got a cross section of it, right?
Yeah.
So
Probably.
again, so they got a cross section of it. It's bone. They're looking at it with their own eyes, and they're standing by that description. If the collagen is gone and you cut into it, and you're claiming that the only thing holding the bone together is this iron on the outside, well, if you cross section that bone, guess what? It's going to crumble into nothing on your theory. But that's obviously not the situation we've got here. But what you're doing here is that you're backing yourself into a corner, trying to grasp at a straw to explain how this is possible. But what you're showing us is that you agree that this bone should not be here if it's really 70 million years old and it's not permineralized. If you didn't see that, you wouldn't be trying to explain away the existence of the collagen of the bone. There's no way the bone is there without the collagen.
Do they say anything about there being collagen in the bone?
Collagen is one of the main component parts of a bone. If you take it away, you don't have a bone anymore. You have a pile of just mineral dust sitting on a table. That's what's holding the bone in its shape. So obviously, these bones could not be described as they are being described if that were the case.
Okay. So I'm going to need a source for bones crumbling to dust without any collagen, because everything I can find just says that the collagen provides structural support.
Exactly.
But
That's exactly what I'm saying. Structural support.
But the bone can be there without the collagen. It's just more brittle. But it's still there.
Are these bones being described as brittle?
They're from the paper?
You're the one that used the word brittle. Where did you get that from? Obviously not from the
getting
paper.
This from sources that are telling me that bone is very brittle without collagen.
But you're not
Are
telling
you asking,
me.
Do they talk about brittleness?
You're not telling me anything I don't know. I'm not convinced you could have a bone at all without collagen. But if you did, I agree. It would be extremely brittle. You would probably crumble to dust at the slightest touch.
Probably. Can you show me that they would?
Can you show me any evidence that the bones that we're actually discussing here can be described in the way that you are describing them now? Because it sounds like you've just pulled this out of nowhere. That's not how they're being described by the paper or anyone else that I'm aware of.
Where did it go? I had the paper here. Where is it?
You know, Paul, you might know this, and I could be wrong, but it seems that I recall them opening up like mummified caskets and that very thing happening because the bones had no opportunity to become mineralized. They just fell apart.
Yeah, I think so. And the reason why these bones are around today, because 4,500 years since the flood, ideally, we wouldn't really expect to even see them on a creation viewpoint either. But these were pulled out of Alaska, the far north of Alaska, in an area where the average temperature is very, very cold year round. And so that is how we can explain how these bones have even survived 4,500 years, let alone 70 million. They definitely would not survive 70 million under the best case. However, how did they survive 4,500 years without being permineralized? That is a legitimate question, and I think it has to at least have a lot to do with the fact that they've been kept in a deep freeze most of the time.
All right. Well, I think, judging by that silence, that wraps
that'll
up
probably
that.
wrap that up. But
I'm just reading.
I appreciate you guys having me again real quick, and I'm sure I will speak to most of you again in the future on another open mic. And I will plug the the upcoming genetic entropy debate, open mic on September 7th. So
Sure.
Absolutely.
Maybe
I was just going to
for my
plug
time-
that. I was just going to
Sorry.
plug that, Paul. September 7th. Doc, don't worry, I'll let you respond real quick.
Yeah.
September 7th, all the critics, non-critics, we are having an epic genetic entropy open mic. Me and Sam will be hosting. Paul will be the presenter and debater. And so please, you're definitely not going to want to miss out on that one. Doc, it sounded like there is something you wanted to add to this specific topic. So go ahead.
Sure. So I'm not finding a lot of specifics, but it does sound like when the bones are excavated from the matrix, so the rock surrounding them, they are typically extremely brittle. The bones we're talking about here. They are not super permineralized, but that can happen sometimes. Fossils are weird. There's a gradient of permineralization.
okay,
And
I'm gonna let you have the last word on that. That fossils are weird.
Yeah, very weird.
How dare you talk that way about fossils? Okay, so with that, Paul, Doc, appreciate the back and forth. God bless Paul. You get a good sleep. Okay, well, what we're going to do is continue the conversation. Sam just finished eating. I'm going to eat real quick, about 10 minutes, as we are at about the 2.5 hour mark. And so, gentlemen, go ahead. I know Secular Muslim and Sam were engaging a bit there too. And so I think over the next couple hours, there's a few different topics we're all going to want to engage, including Doc. We'll chat about the hominin fossil record at some point as well. So, okay, gentlemen, go ahead and let's have some fun.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just as a side note, you don't have to answer secular Muslim, but what exactly is a secular Muslim?
I'm a Muslim culturally, not really like I believe in this literally, but there's more to Islam than just its religion, but as a cultural heritage. We revere the Quran, but I don't take it literally.
So you don't believe in a literal creation like I believe most Muslims do?
Correct.
Okay.
There's other ways to do spirituality other than believing in supernaturalism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd love to talk with you about that, but that won't be on this particular stream. But as far as your objection to biblical creation, is there anything that was unclear with our response?
Yeah. You said that we have about 100-something genetic deformities. I'm sorry, I don't know if it was you, somebody else. But if you go back the generations, we see less genetic deformities. And so if we just go back enough, a couple of thousand years, there will be no genetic deformities. I just don't. How do you even know that? Like, how do you notice that? What evidence is there for that other than just the claim?
Yeah, well, ironically, Jackson brought up molecular clocks in his discussion with Dr. Hovind. And so those molecular clocks are the very thing that we would point to. And we would talk about how each generation accumulates approximately 100 new mutations. So within your DNA, there's going to be errors. We'll call those errors. And so because each generation is going to accumulate more errors, if we extrapolate that back in the past, then those errors would be reduced by approximately that same amount or so. So that puts us at a perfect genome at some point in the past, and we would argue what that point is. But then, interestingly, it has a problem moving forward into the future too, because moving forward into the future, that would put a shelf life on genomes. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, that molecular clock that Jackson brought up.
I think I have a modern day example that might call that into question.
Well, you would just be. Go ahead.
The North Sentinelese, they live in an island secluded. They're about like 20 miles off the coast of India, but they're so secluded that they've barely mingled genetically with anybody around the world for tens of thousands of years by every estimate. So if the whole mutations argument is true, they would be like genetically superior than us, but they seem to be genetically inferior to us.
Right. No, they wouldn't be genetically superior. They would be genetically inferior.
I don't think we have any North Sentinelese DNA, actually.
Now, you understand that mutations are overwhelmingly harmful. You can call them neutral, but they are still errors. So however you want to classify them, you can say that they're nearly neutral, but even nearly neutral would be slightly deleterious. Right. And by the way, you're welcome to argue against this, and it's fine, but you would be contradicting the original point that you brought up, which would be that small populations where inbreeding occurs is a problem.
Let me give an example of something that has a very small genome. Viroids, I think it's like 13,000 nucleotides, maybe less than that. I think that's what I want to say it is. And they have a really high mutation rate. Viroids infect a lot of plant species. So shouldn't they, in the last, let's say they've existed for, let's say they've had mutations for the past 4,000 years. Shouldn't these things that have a huge mutation rate and a really small genome, shouldn't they have just erased themselves from existence?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that would be a categorical error, because you would be comparing something where there are too many unknowns. So, for example, like their correction mechanisms within their genomes, are those compatible with humans? And when certain harmful mutations occur in those things, are they removed by natural selection at a faster rate than humans? So that's why I would say that it would be a categorical error. The same thing with bacteria. It's common that people bring up bacteria when talking about this decay problem. But the problem with bacteria is because they're single-celled organisms, right? If there's a problem there, then the whole thing's just going to die fast. They're not going to accumulate mutations in the same way that humans will.
Actually, if I could say something too, specifically to a couple of secular Muslims' points. We were talking earlier about Adam and Eve and how can we track our genetics back to Adam and Eve. Well, our autosomal nuclear DNA, that's where we find roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation. But we also have what's called uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. That's the Y chromosome, which is nuclear DNA, but it is only passed down from one side, the father's side. You got your Y chromosome from your dad. Then we also have mitochondrial DNA. That's its own little DNA compartment outside of the nucleus. And that mutation rate is about 0.5 per generation. The Y chromosome is about somewhere between 1 and 3. Either way, it's really fast. Okay, it's a lot fast. So for example, here in a recent paper in 2022, notice how it talks about the pedigree rates. That's the observed mutation rate. Jackson Rowe earlier was talking about a molecular clock. That's the observed mutation rate. You can basically take, grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, count out the amount of differences in the mitochondrial DNA and come up with a mutation rate. And so they point out it's about 10-fold, 10 times higher than what's called a phylogenetic rate. That's the evolutionary mutation rate. Anyways, the point I wanted to make is these are two phylogenetic trees. Okay, this is a mitochondrial phylogenetic tree, and this is a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. So this is worldwide DNA variation. I want to focus specifically on the mitochondrial DNA. So this is worldwide female diversity, basically, since the mitochondrial DNA is passed on the mother's side. Well, we've actually got Eve sequence. So here there's people groups, okay, HVR haplogroup, most common in Europe, and we know how much variation separates any two people. So let's say me and Sam, me and Jackson Rowe, your average is about somewhere between 20 and 25 DNA differences separating any two people. That's nothing. That's trivial. And in light of a fast mutation rate, it only takes a couple hundred generations to generate that kind of variety. Okay. And so we've actually got the Eve consensus sequence. We know what her mitochondrial genome was. And there's far too little variation in light of the fast mutation rate for deep time evolution to be true. And so in a nutshell, my point is this. Yes, using genetics, we've tracked back to Eve, who would have had a perfect genome, because we're tracking back to where there's none of those differences separating any two people. Okay, so firstly, tell me if that makes sense, and what are your thoughts on that?
Who are you asking?
Secular Muslims specifically, but if this is new to him, anybody can respond.
Yeah, this is new. I just don't know how exactly you are tracing back. This seems to be a model. It seems to be just an application of a theory. I just don't see how you're tracing it. Like, there's no evidence of Adam and Eve, so how can you even know that?
Yes, it's right here.
It would be extinct.
Are you familiar with mitochondrial Eve and Y
No.
chromosome Adam? Literally all female mitochondrial DNA goes back to a single mitochondrial DNA ancestor. Now, you want to put that ancestor somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago in Africa. But the genetic variation doesn't allow for that, because this is not something creationists made up, secular Muslim. You can get this DNA variation from the 1,000 Genomes Project, and you can reflect it using a tree building program in an unrooted phylogenetic tree. And so you can see explosive growth from a center point. We know the mutation rate is fast, and we know there's only a few DNA differences separating any two people. And so my question for you, how do you put mitochondrial Eve back 200,000 years ago if on average we're only separated by 20 to 25 DNA differences? Remember, the mutation rate is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5 per generation. That's fast. That means it only takes a couple hundred generations to produce this amount of DNA variety. Go ahead, secular Muslim.
No, I'm just gonna have to look into it more when I gonna just have to compare the evidence.
Well, and notice this: if you're familiar with the biblical story of the repopulation of the planet, basically in terms of humans after the flood, you've got Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, right, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. Well, what did you learn tonight? You learned that mitochondrial DNA is passed down on the mother's side. Notice what's called haplogroups. These are the three major haplogroups, L, M, and N. Well, when we start from the Bible, we understand that all people today descended from those three reproducing couples, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their three wives. But what do we find on a mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree? Notice three major haplogroups corresponding to Noah's three daughters-in-law, and explosive growth from those center points. Now, to you, you'd have to say that's a coincidence. But to us as creationists, we would say this fits perfectly. After the flood, about 4,500 years ago, you have all people descending from those three original reproducing couples. And lo and behold, we got three major haplogroups, short lines separating those groups, long lines radiating out, suggesting post-flood history. What are your thoughts on that? Speak to that a little bit.
You're still on mute, bud.
You might be.
I was saying no.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. To take your time. Go ahead. You're on mute.
No. No, I've heard the opposite from secular sources. So
Which
you guys
sources?
are, just citing different sources.
Yeah, you know,
this is just a mitochondrial DNA tree based on worldwide mitochondrial DNA variation. And so your sources are going to be based on interpretations and inferences using a phylogenetic mutation rate. But this is just right in your face. This is just the manifestation of DNA variation, and it falls into a tree that allows for three major haplogroups. We all come from Noah's three daughters-in-law. I mean, you said that you came out of biblical creation. You're now a secularist. You believe in evolution, but you haven't seen this data presented before. So it makes me wonder if you made an informed choice to reject biblical creation, because this is some of our most powerful evidence and you don't seem familiar with it. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I did. I remember Ken Ham's debate with Bill Nye. I have gone to the Creation Museum. I have heard the scientific evidence from Answers in Genesis. I was mostly influenced by Answers in Genesis, but I just started seeing unscientific things in the Bible. For example, incest. So
yeah, but the incest we already addressed.
This,
it's not a scientific problem.
Right. I'm just clarifying, like, because you said I haven't gone into any of this. Like,
okay,
no,
I
haven't heard any of this, and I'm just saying I have before.
You know,
so
Richard,
yeah, when it comes to that objection, that's what I got. That's all I have for that. I just have one more unscientific thing that I found in the Bible, but it might be unrelated to genomes. So I don't want to
before you
somewhere
do
else yet.
Yeah, before you do, you know, Richard Dawkins made the point that he couldn't imagine what it would have been like to be an atheist before the time of Charles Darwin. Because where could they get their intellectual fulfillment? They were living in God's world and they knew it, and that's how all of the data was interpreted. But then when Charles Darwin came along, he gave a new perspective, a different way to interpret the data, which justifies this void that the atheists had, this intellectual void. But I find it interesting that when people like such as yourself are presented with the data, you're just stymied. I mean, we're not, as this critic in the chat says, just saying, well, you know, we're just throwing the Bible at you. I'll be happy to defend that, but that's not what's been taking place tonight. You've been presented with the scientific data, and we've addressed your points, and there's really nothing left for you.
I didn't say you were throwing the Bible at me. When you presented the
critic in
charts.
chat, not you. Yeah, there's a critic in chat who's kind of
right. I'm not denying the data.
argument.
That's why I haven't responded. I'm just looking at the data now, and so I don't have an immediate answer. So
that's fair. That's
and,
fine.
And another thing too, in great points, Sam, to the question of a literal Adam and Eve, secular Muslim, I showed you the data supporting a literal historical Eve who lived just thousands of years ago based on observed DNA variation. What about Y chromosomes? Every single human male Y chromosome on the planet, we'll get to you, Jackson, is nearly identical, 99.99% the same. And you can plot Y chromosomal DNA variation on a phylogenetic tree, and you have a last Y chromosomal ancestor that goes back just thousands of years ago, who we'd say is to Noah. And so we have a singular woman from whom we've all descended from using mitochondrial DNA, a single man that we've all descended from using Y chromosomal DNA variation. And if you want to bring in, according to the evolutionary model, our supposed closest living relative or closest cousin, the chimpanzee, when you compare, I should put a visual here just for you to see, to be fair. When you compare Y chromosomes, and I know Jackson will have something to say to this too, but let secular Muslim give his thoughts first. When you compare the Y chromosomes of our so-called closest cousin, the chimpanzee, notice, I mean, this is pathetic. This is the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Here's the human Y chromosome. Mind you, all human Y chromosomes are nearly identical, the same. Okay, very little variation. Bring in the chimpanzee, it's half the size. The gene content's totally different. The architecture is totally different. So when you consider overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, the human and chimpanzee Y chromosomes are only about 35% the same. So secular Muslim, using critical thinking skills, in case this is the first time you've heard this before, how do you address this? How do you account for such massive genomic changes or alterations in just, 6 million years since the split, roughly? And here's a visual representation. This is the chimp Y. This is the human Y. To the biblical creationists, this makes sense. They're totally different because we're not related to the chimps. But you're arguing for a relationship. And so speak to this for a little bit. What are your thoughts on this? Do you find this to be curious?
Yeah, very curious. I've heard a 97% number, 98% number, that we share 97 to 98% of our genetic material with chimpanzees, but what you're presenting here seems different than that. So I would have to look at the sources and go back and compare them.
Well, do you know the difference between Y chromosome DNA and autosomal DNA?
No.
Okay, this specifically is Y chromosomal DNA. So this is uniparentally inherited DNA. There's no recombination in Y chromosome. So it's relatively more stable. Okay. And so the Y chromosome should be more similar between humans and chimpanzees. Your autosomal DNA, that experiences, you get two copies, right? One copy from your dad, one copy from your mom, and you get recombination. Every generation, your chromosomes reshuffle, basically creating new chromosomal varieties. But in this case, there's little to no recombination. There might be some gene conversion, but it's still relatively more stable. So if you want to include everything, that's what you're referring to. When you include everything, you're looking at somewhere between 96 and 97%. But even there, you're missing massive gaps, copy number variations, size differences. Centromeric DNA is oftentimes left out. And so there's debate there if it really is 96%, but it's no sweat off my back. 96% doesn't matter. The Y chromosome is the fatal blow. And so the Y chromosomes are drastically different, secular Muslim. And so this is something I would highly recommend you look into. Do you have any clues, anything at the top of your head, anything coming to mind as to how, from an evolutionary starting point, the Y chromosomes could be so different? Not to put you on the spot, but is there anything that's kind of popping out from your past research as to why this is the case?
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, well, I've noticed a couple things about that graph. Can you put it back up?
Sure.
Okay. All right, you see the human one. It's obviously longest. Gorilla's long too, but they're not the closest. But you see chimpanzee and bonobo.
Right.
They're very closely related, and you see their Y chromosomes are fairly different right there. But let's get even more closely related. You see the Bornean and Sumatran orangutan on the right of the screen,
Right. Yeah.
and their Y chromosomes are very different also. Now,
Right.
now with molecular clock evidence, they say humans and chimps go back, what, 7 million years? Bonobos and chimps way less than that, and there's still some variation there.
About 2 million.
Right. Borneo, Sumatran orangutans, not very much at all. Some variation there. I mean, I think you would agree that Borneo and Sumatran orangutans would probably share a common ancestor in some other orangutan, right?
Right. I would argue that the phylogeny in terms of primates would be humans as their own created kind. You'd have an orangutan-like ancestor, chimp-like ancestor that includes bonobos, and then also your gorilla ancestor. And I think the Y chromosome data actually strongly supports that. And so if I were to go back to it, and as I'm doing so, feel free to keep speaking, Jackson, make your point or finish your point.
Well, I think just the amount of time that each has diverged and the difference in the Y chromosome kind of lines up.
Okay, I get what you're saying, but unfortunately, you'd be committing an extrapolation fallacy because yes, your chimpanzee and bonobo Y chromosomes are slightly different, but they're nowhere near as different as the human is to the chimp and the human is to the bonobo. You can also specifically look at the gene content, and you'll notice that the gene content is relatively the same between chimpanzees and bonobos. There's mostly just some missing genes. Size is a little different, but you can see how similar these sections are.
Yeah, you would expect them to be similar. They're very closely related.
Well, and I'd expect them to be similar too because they're related in the biblical creation model too. Chimps and bonobos, I'd argue, go back to a common archetype. And so I would argue humans are their own created kind, which is why the Y chromosome is so dissimilar. As a matter of fact, the human Y and the gorilla Y, you'll notice on the visual, are more similar to each other than either are to the chimpanzee or bonobo Y.
Well, in size, probably not in content. I would have to look into that though.
If you check the paper, you can see like what the light gray means, what the black means. You know, is it heterochromatin? Is it euchromatin? The different portions or types of genetic content within the Y chromosome. And you'll notice it's not very difficult to account for the chimpanzee and bonobo differences in light of the way chimpanzees and bonobos exist in polygamous relationships, sperm competition, other factors. It makes sense why there is some difference here. And I think it can be accounted for quite easily.
Doesn't that Y chromosome, that competition, doesn't that explain one of the reasons our Y chromosomes are so different?
I don't think so, because, and notice this on screen, when it actually comes to the chimpanzee, bonobo, and human Y, if you want to bring the human Y into there, now you're not just having to explain a little bit of gene loss, a little bit of size difference. You actually have to now explain wholesale rearrangement of significant parts, the evolution of entire gene families. So not just the loss of some genes or genetic content, but the evolution, the addition of entire gene families, yet stay homogeneous within a species. What I mean is all humans have a Y chromosome that's nearly identical, right? But when you bring in the chimpanzees, there's a lot of dissimilarity there. I would argue you're extrapolating it without any experimental data. So for example, this is from 2020. As far as I know, this is one of the latest discussions or thoughts on this issue. And so this is from the secular literature, and they point out that they do have a hypothesis which involves sperm competition. But they point out that this hypothesis needs to be evaluated in subsequent studies. And so currently it's just a hypothesis. It's an idea. Okay. But it's an idea that hasn't actually been tested. And so I would argue it's not science. It's a story. It's a hypothesis. You can believe it needs more work. But until that work is done, then you'd be hard pressed to argue a strong case for chimpanzee and human relationship, evolutionary speaking, until this work is done. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I've kind of forgotten most of these arguments about the Y chromosome, to be honest. But I'm just looking at the graph.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the graph. There's the phylogeny challenge from Aaron Ra. You know, show me created kinds. It's like, I'm showing you right here. This is from the secular data. This is the conventional data. And it lines up perfectly with the phylogeny over here that I defend. Okay. This is my starting point. The Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. The Bible claims that, or points out basically, that humans are created. Adam's the first man, Eve, the mother of all living, created separate and independent from any other form of life. And so from that starting point, you know, we build a model as humans within their own created kind. Here's the extinct groups we can get into in a bit. I know you like the hominin fossil record.
Yeah.
And then I would place your primates, who you would call non-human great apes, chimps as their own kind, gorillas as their own kind, and orangutans as their own kind. Now I take a line of data, specifically the Y chromosome, and I match it up as best as I can to my model and see how it matches. And it matches great. I mean, this is not young earth creationist work right here.
No.
And yet it matches up so nicely. Human is their own kind, chimps and bonobos is their own kind, gorillas is their own kind, orangutans is their own kind. Matches up beautifully. What are your thoughts, Jackson?
Well, I mean, just looking at the graph again, we're looking at the Y chromosomes and their differences. Look at the X chromosomes on chimps and humans and their similarities.
Sure. Yeah.
It's basically identical.
Well, that doesn't take away from the... See, I like to point out that the differences make all the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Similarities in general... Sam, tell me if you agree with this, you know, from a creationist perspective. Similarities in general are more or less agnostic to the creation versus evolution debate, because you would argue for similarity or homology due to common descent with modification, right? These similar structures have been inherited from past common ancestors. We as a creationist, we would look to common design to explain homologous patterns in the biological world. Human engineers design in homologous patterns. Why wouldn't God? And that's why I say the differences make all the difference, because I believe the differences is where the discriminatory lines of evidence reside. And it's a line of evidence like the Y chromosome dissimilarity that I strongly believe the evolutionary community lacks a good explanation for, or at least a tested explanation, while the biblical creation model can account for it nicely without any storytelling or extrapolation fallacies invoked. Go ahead.
Well, again, looking at the Bornean and Sumatran orangutans, they probably haven't been diverged for more than, what, 1 million years? And they're significantly different. So something that's diverged for 7 or so million years, I think it varies, like a lot, but I mean, you would expect it to be a little even more different than that.
You got to test that, though, because
right.
Even with your orangutans, there's no necessity for wholesale rearrangement of significant parts. You don't really have to account for the evolution of entire gene families, right? Even the content, just looking at it without the bar in terms of which color is each heterochromatin, so on and so forth. There's not that much difference. There's quite a bit of similarity. You know, I'd like to see a percentage, but again, bring in the human. Your most dissimilar is for sure human and chimp. I mean, there's so much, even in the human Y, that's not even in the chimpanzee Y, or that's in the chimpanzee Y, but in a very minimal amount. You know, at the very least, you'd have to at least agree this is a specific point consistent with separate ancestry.
Well, I mean, it can be if you make it that way, I guess. But the way I see it, it can also line up with what I'm saying.
Well, I appreciate that. I definitely don't want to take up the entire time on that issue, but I do believe that the Y chromosome data, the mitochondrial DNA data, and these massive differences in Y chromosome has a more parsimonious explanation within the separate ancestry model rather than the universal common ancestry model.
So can I ask something really quick?
No questions allowed, Doc. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, so during the global flood that you say happened, would aquatic animals have experienced a genetic bottleneck?
We seem to, and Sam, you can feel free to jump in anytime too, give your thoughts. We seem to find within various genetic boundary study, one that comes to mind is the Rockefeller study, where they looked at the CO1 gene, that highly conserved mitochondrial DNA protein, basically. And they concluded that over 90% of all species today have arisen at the same time because of low genetic variation. They invoked a bottleneck, and that also involves aquatic life. Aquatic life universally, if I'm not mistaken, in that study, they say experienced a bottleneck. And so I'd argue that's consistent with the flood.
So I'm pretty sure it didn't mean that all those species were created at the same time, but
well, no, it would be the flood bottleneck. So what do biblical creationists say about the flood? Do we say that was a creation event?
I mean, it's a creationist event.
Well, it's not a creation event. The creation event goes back 6,000 years. But we place this bottleneck, this near extinction event, 4,500 years. And so all extant species today, where it's talking about 90% of species today arose at the same time in the not so distant past. This is the genetic boundary study. We'd say they originated from archetypes. So this wasn't a creation event. This was basically, go ahead. I think you know what I mean.
So as you said, archetypes, but I actually do kind of like that. Sorry. So
I coined it.
Agree. That would be, let's say, a prediction for land animals. But why for aquatic animals? Why would they have a bottleneck at the same time when they can swim?
Well, it sounds like, oh, Sam, you're going to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, there's a few reasons why that could be the case. So for one reason, and I'm not sure that all creationists would agree on this, but let's say that the water is fresh water, which I think that it was. But as the salinity started to increase, there would be a lot of fish that wouldn't be able to survive. So that would be one cause for them to die. You'd have like turbulence, and you'd have a lot of debris in the soil. So that would cause a lot of them to die. You might have some heat. We're not sure how much that would be. I mean, obviously, things survived. So the secular camp would be wrong on their assumptions. They haven't actually shown anything definitive. So there's a lot of reasons that that would cause the marine life to be reduced drastically. Okay.
What about things that breathe air but swim, like, say, whales that have no problem bobbing up at the surface?
What about them?
Why would they be experiencing a bottleneck during this time when they are not really in danger of drowning?
Yeah, I mean, again, like we know that the Bible says that, all things they follow a kind, and I can answer your question that you asked Kent earlier. A kind would be an organism that derives from an original created gene pool. That doesn't mean that they're sexually compatible today. So we don't really know what those original created kinds are, and I don't know that we could really know how many animals did die off. So I mean, I think a lot of that's going to be guesswork.
Sure, fair.
If I could add, if I could confirm that, Doc, my definition of a kind as well would be groups of organisms that go back to a common ancestral gene pool, as Sam said. And so, yes, some variations within a created kind could diverge enough where they're no longer interfertile, but that doesn't mean they don't belong to the same kind. I think genetics can determine what does and what doesn't belong to the same kind. So just to kind of
fair.
Okay,
Just
go ahead.
my whole reason for asking all this was because both sperm whales and giant squids have a mitochondrial eve.
Do you have a? I'm not saying that that's not the case.
Yep. I
But
have
do you
sources.
have a? Yeah, I'd like to see
Yep,
that for sure.
Just sent them in the chat.
Because that has been a question that Matt and myself, who's my ministry partner, we've thought is important and interesting. How many other creatures can be traced back to, a single either mitochondrial DNA ancestor or Y chromosomal ancestor?
And also, last I would like to say on this topic, we do have an explanation for why there is a mitochondrial eve. I'm not a geneticist, I'm not an expert, but there is an explanation. And
Coalescence?
I think the Wikipedia page actually explains it pretty well.
So from my understanding, let me say this real quick, Sam. Also, just how catastrophic the worldwide flood was and how much heat, energy, and radiation would have been given off during that year-long period, that would have killed off a lot of the whales as well. So just because a creature can come up for air or doesn't exist, deep within the ocean or the sea, doesn't mean that they're not going to be knocked out to just a few individuals.
Fair. But then you would have to give evidence that this catastrophic event took place.
No, that would be a non sequitur.
How?
Because you're dealing with a worldview.
No. So
a worldview.
You're saying there was this selection
Let
event.
me
You show that
answer
the event took place.
Let me answer your question. You're dealing with a worldview. A worldview is a package deal. And it would be no different than if you were to, let's say, land on the moon and find a piece of art there. If someone were to say, hey, this can't be a piece of art until you tell me who the author was. Well, that would be a non sequitur. That would be a silly thing to argue. Whether or not you're convinced, because ultimately when you're talking about proving something, you're not really speaking about anything more than your own incredulity. And I would argue that the global flood has been proven because the revelation of God is true. And so if you want to argue with that and explain to me how it's false, then you might have something. But if you're not prepared to do that, then again, it wouldn't follow that because you're incredulous, you have a mental state and a state of disbelief. It doesn't follow from that the global flood hasn't been proven. So you've got two answers there. One of them is that it's a fallacy, and the other one would be a challenge to you directly. So you can run with either one of those.
So first, not a fallacy. You guys are saying there was this event that caused a genetic bottleneck. So if you can't show the event happened, the event didn't happen.
But the genetic data does show that it happened because...
But there's an explanation for that.
No, hold on. So again, I explained to you why that's the case, and my example again would be that if you were to find some sort of artifact somewhere to ask, who did it or whatever, that would be a non sequitur. And when you're dealing with a worldview, just really quick, you're dealing with a whole explanation of reality, a complete explanation of reality. And so that would include the way that one interprets the data. And so when you're asking about what type of proofs that we have or individual lines of evidence, then we would also present you the way that we interpret the geological column. See, but you want to reject that, and that's fine, but that's the thing that we're arguing about here. But your question just reveals that you don't understand what a worldview is. That's what you're arguing against.
And before you respond, Doc, I want to give you as much time as you need to respond before we move on to another topic. As I have it on my mind, when it comes to these archetypes, okay, whether it's land animals or even water creatures, you can even go as far as whales. I would say the catastrophic nature of the flood to begin with, rapid plate tectonics. We could get in evidence for the flood for sure. I mean, the massive slabs of cool rock that we found near Earth's mantle, basically deep within the Earth, that still has a relatively cool temperature, I would say, is testimony to the predictive power of catastrophic plate tectonics. But even without going into the geological reasons why there's a flood, the genetic data, again, that boundary study where they looked at the CO1 gene, the Rockefeller study, they determined that based on levels of genetic variation, all creatures, including marine creatures, experienced a bottleneck, a near extinction event. And 90% of all species arose at the same time. And that makes sense. Why not 100%? Well, you have your surviving archetypes off of the ark, and then your few water kinds that manage to survive as well. And so from there, just those front-loaded created DNA differences, recombination, gene conversion, mutations after the flood could explain all the varieties we see today. So for example, you have your bear archetype, right? And from there, shuffle up those DNA differences. In a few thousand years, you've got your different species. But it's the genetic data that tells us there was this worldwide bottleneck. Well, to the biblical creationists, that makes sense. The Bible talks about a worldwide flood where there was a universal bottleneck. And you guys may have a different conclusion to that, but I would argue that your conclusion is not consistent with the available evidence that we do have. Doc, go ahead. Take your time. Respond to anything you'd like to.
Okay. First, if there was a global flood, what do you think we would expect to see?
The geological column.
What in the geology would you expect to see?
Layers laid down hydrologically, evidence of a hydrological catastrophism. So your question might work with someone like Paleologos, who rejects a literary reading of the scripture. That would be a fair question to ask him. I don't know how he would respond to that, because if I understand his position right, he affirms that the secular interpretation of the geological column, as opposed to
he is a young Earth creation. He is a young Earth creationist, though.
Okay. Well, but regarding the question you asked, the evidence that I would put forth would be the geological column, and then I would remind you again that you're dealing with a worldview, and a worldview would include the way that we interpret the data.
Okay, so where to start?
Wherever you want.
When it comes to hydrologic sorting, do you know how sediments are sorted in a flood?
Yeah, there have been numerous experiments in stratification. Kent mentioned them multiple times. In fact, to be fair, he's been encouraging you guys to actually do your research on that and go and watch those videos that are readily available and in experiments conducted by secular universities within these watery these experiments. So I'm not sure why you haven't done that, but
are you familiar, Doc, with the very powerful prediction, I would argue, based on the catastrophic plate tectonics model that Dr. John Baumgartner has put forth? He predicted that we should find evidence for what's called runaway subduction. During the flood year, you have your plates essentially moving at meters per second movements through the floodwaters. And relatively recently, we found these subducted cold slabs deep within the earth. And many of these slabs go down hundreds of miles into the deep hot mantle. Well, it turns out that these slabs of cool rock, they're the same density as they are at the surface. And because they're the same density, that implies they're the same temperature. So these slabs, they haven't even warmed up to the surrounding material or They haven't completely melted, and they're still cool, I would argue, because they were just subducted or taken down there thousands of years ago during this flood event. Your uniformitarian or actualist scientists, they struggle with this, because if those were taken down there millions of years ago, they should have, as I pointed out, warmed up or even melted.
So cold slabs is a relative term. I think the normal measured temperature for them is about 700 degrees Celsius. That said, the reason why they've remained cool is because cold slabs are mostly subducted oceanic crust, and oceanic crust, as you might expect, is very much enriched with water. And that water tends to be the thing that absorbs most of the heat, but the water is heated up and rises away from the cold slab, taking the heat with it. And the reason why a lot of these cold slabs have remained cold, quote unquote, is mostly because of the sheer mass of both the rock and the water. And also just, I'm trying to get my friend Beamsy in here, because he actually knows enough physics to do the calculations. But frankly, if catastrophic plate tectonics happened, the friction alone would have turned the Earth into a ball of plasma. There's not enough mass on the planet to absorb that heat.
I would argue.
You don't know what.
Actually, let me just say this, Sam, and then you, because I want to specifically talk about the cold slabs. If my wife brought me down a coffee and I put an ice cube in it, right, and then walked away, and somebody came down later and that ice cube was still there, let's say it was half the size, it hadn't melted yet. I mean, would you conclude that that coffee was, that ice cube was there for a long time or a short amount of time? Regardless of the size, I think it's more parsimonious to say, okay, the reason why we've got a hot cup of coffee here with an ice cube that hasn't completely melted is because that coffee is relatively fresh and the ice cube was more or less just put in there. And so, again, I would say that the fact that we find these slabs going down hundreds of miles into the deep hot mantle, the more parsimonious explanation is that they were taken down there just thousands of years ago during a year-long catastrophic event where these continents or plates are basically moving at meters per second. And I would argue that the friction would not have resulted in the melting of the crust completely, for one reason, because we find those cold slabs. Those cold slabs shouldn't be there if there was as much friction related heat given off as you would. Plus, heat and energy is necessary to get the plates moving in the first place. So I would say that heat from the friction that you're talking about, Doc, that is more of a feature rather than a problem, put it that way.
Sorry, I did a little bit more reading on the cold slabs while you were talking.
Sure.
Okay. So first, a cold slab isn't the same temperature all the way through. The farther you go into the mantle, the hotter the cold slab is. And we would expect that because that material has been subducted for longer. And eventually, the gradient goes so deep that we can't measure them anymore. Second, the friction that I'm talking about. So most creationist organizations say that Pangea was what the world looked like before the flood, right? All the continents together?
Well, most, I guess, informed creationists would say that Pangea was a temporary supercontinent during the flood that came together and then separated again. And the pre-flood supercontinent was more like Rodinia.
Okay, fair. Either one works. So with Pangea then, if you took all of the tectonic plates as they were and then moved them to their current location over the course of the year and then stopped them, or at least slowed them down to their current rates, that friction is the heat that would, again, plasmify, I don't know the correct term, the planet. Like there is not enough mass. Beamsy is here. He can do the math.
No, I did the math and it was terrifying.
Okay,
Would you
Sam,
like
I
to
know you
explain
wanted to
this?
respond. I don't want to hog the mic. I could certainly give some more thoughts on that. But Sam, I know you wanted to say something too.
Yeah, no, I just point out that, the Bible says that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And so this water that was underneath the earth came up. And so that means that there was like a liquidy type substrate underneath the layers of the crust. And we know currently there's more water actually under the earth than there is above it. So, all of these, yeah, and ringwillite.
Yes,
I
that's
believe
not water.
ringwillite, yeah. Well, let me finish my thought, Beamsy.
But if you want to say something, be accurate.
Well, Beamsy, you can behave like an adult and let me finish my thought, and then we'll give you time to address it. That's how the stream's been going all night. Okay? So don't come in here all hot and bothered. So we don't know what those starting assumptions that you guys are making, or even some creationists are making with all of these numbers. We simply don't know what those conditions were like. So if there was a large liquid body of water underneath the continents, then there would be more of a floating and less of a grinding. You simply don't know. Do you know?
Well,
I'd like to hear it.
the guys with the rate experiment, didn't they say it would be like 24,000 degrees Celsius?
Yeah. So again, I mean, we're making assumptions, and those assumptions that we know what the Earth was like at the time. We know what was underneath these continents.
What the temperature of the core was,
floating
right?
on masses of water. So unless you know, if you actually know, that would be something.
Or maybe that heat and radiation was actually taken into the core, and the reason why the core is so hot today is for that reason, and therefore it wasn't as hot pre-flood. Does that make sense? Because yeah, we don't necessarily know the exact conditions of the pre-flood world and all the various heat sinks that could have taken up or absorbed a lot of that heat, a lot of that radiation.
But then there would have been no magnetic field. There wouldn't have been enough heat or anything to keep the ball molten and spinning, and the Earth wouldn't have had a magnetic field before the flood, if that was the case, wouldn't it?
No, it would have been at that limit or point where it would allow for the magnetic field, a healthy magnetic field, but also enough of that heat and energy to be absorbed or directed into the core itself. Also used in the first place to get the plates moving, and also utilized to produce all of the coal, oil, and natural gas that we have today. Heat and pressure can rapidly form coal, oil, and natural gas. And we know there's meters upon meters of thick coal beds that exist on this planet that heat and energy could have been used to rapidly form.
Yeah, we also know that water does very interesting things, especially when it's under pressure. So, for example, the water will only reach a certain temperature before it starts to boil. It won't go any higher than that. So when you put water under pressure, you can raise the temperature of that water. But again, water also disperses heat. It's an excellent way to store energy and disperse heat. And water does some interesting things. So, I guess if you guys know the exact conditions, then you might have something when you run your numbers. But if you're just running numbers based off of assumptions and saying that I need to accept them, I don't.
So can Beamsy give his answer, please?
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah.
The aspect of saying that below the crust there is oceans of water is very much incorrect. It is, as you said, it's actually imbued within rock. So it's not water under the crust. So saying that is very dishonest and creating a very bad image. The idea of saying that the core was cooler than what it is now is very much misleading, because how would we have volcanic activity then?
So, Beamsy, before you come in here all hot and bothered and accuse me of being dishonest, it would help if you actually listened to what I was saying.
I did not call you
yes,
dishonest. I was
the
saying you were
oceans.
misrepresenting
Hold on, bud. Calm down. The oceans are not under the crust today, right? Because the fountains of the great deep burst forth. A lot of that water escaped. So again, you're looking at the world today, and you're making a lot of assumptions, and you're extrapolating those to the past, and then you're running numbers based off those extrapolations. And what I'm saying is those extrapolations are unjustified unless you know something. Do you know something?
I was bringing out the point that you said, as now we have water under the crust. That's the part I was pointing out.
Before the
Where you're
fountains
being
broke-
misleading.
Yeah, go ahead. So before the fountains of the deep broke forth, Beamsy, where was the water?
Where was the water? What? As in, are you
Yeah.
talking about there were liquid oceans below the crust?
If I could add this real quick, I do have a source here that says there's a finding that suggests a massive reservoir of water that's hidden in the Earth's mantle more than 400 miles below the surface. So there
Made
seems
up
to be a lot
of?
Pardon?
Made up of? There, it gives you the mineral that it's actually imbued in. It's not an actual liquid water.
What happens, and maybe you would know this, and I'm asking you this because I don't know. What happens when you heat that mineral up? How do you extract the water from that mineral?
It normally goes into hydrogen sulfate, and that's how it actually gets raised up through the crust.
Is there heat involved with that?
Yes.
So when it heats up, the water is extracted.
No, the hydrogen sulfate's extracted.
There we go. It said ringwoodite.
Yeah.
From my understanding, ringwoodite can be made of water.
No, it contains a large amount of water.
Okay.
Right. And so
and that
how do you
exists
extract
in the Earth mantle.
How do you
Yes.
extract the water, Beamsy?
From which province?
Well, I'm asking you, like, hypothetically, if there was an event that caused some heat, would that not separate the water from the mineral?
You'll need to heat it up to at least 3,000 degrees Kelvin.
Well, I mean, you guys are the ones that say there's this heat and radiation problem. You have the
Yeah.
fountains of the great deep breaking open, right, where these subterranean water vents basically burst forth. You'd have magma and lava coming through as well. And so all of, just as we see in this source, 3 times the volume of water on the surface exists trapped in these rocks. And so if the fountains of the great deep break open, these rocks would release all of this water.
The thing is, if you actually were talking about ringwoodite, it would be, and it was underneath at great pressure, it would actually come up as hydrogen sulfide, not as water.
Right. Here's my problem. Here's the problem that I'm trying to make clear. When a critic suggests that there's a heat problem, and I start asking them questions about the preconditions, and we just get mystery. Well, I mean, how do you know there's a heat problem? You don't know what the starting conditions were like. I mean, that's
Beans
fine.
already addressed that.
It's fine that you have a worldview and you want to attack ours, but I mean, you got to do a better job. That's all. I mean, if you're going to tell me I have a heat problem, then you're going to need to tell me what those starting conditions are. Because if you can't tell me what those starting conditions are, well, then I'm just not really convinced.
Well,
That's
the
all.
issue that you're putting forward is saying that there were oceans of water underneath the crust. The pressure and the temperature would actually disallow that. If you still want volcanic activity, there would be no way for volcanic activity to occur if we had oceans of water under the crust.
Can I jump in real quick?
You would not be able to have that amount of heat as well as liquid water.
Yeah.
If it was ringwoodite, if that creates a second problem, because the water would come out as hydrogen sulfide, and then it would oxidize and then become water with the sulfur left as a poisonous gas.
Yeah.
Let me ask something real quick.
Go ahead, T-Rock.
Okay. So, Beamsy, I apologize. I do not know you very well. I don't know what your credentials are, but I take it you're a geologist?
Yes.
Okay. Water coming out of the crust. Do we not have water coming out of the ocean floor today?
You're talking about artesian basins.
Okay. But it sounds like you're saying they can't be under the continent. but they can be in the ocean floor.
No,
Would
they
you like to
can be in the
explain those,
continent.
Budinsky, or would you like me to?
Oh, you can. I'm drugged off my face, so I'm just probably going to be rude, unfortunately.
Fair. Okay, so hydrothermal vents, which I mean that's the term I've heard for them.
Wait,
They're
hold on.
fueled by
Dino, real quick. I'm sorry. I don't want to. I wanted to address one more thing that Beamsy said. Don't lose your thought, though. And then T-Rock, I'm welcome to the stage. I'm sure if you want to engage for a while, you can. But Beamsy, when you said that you can't have water escaping and then volcanism at the same time, I mean, are you just assuming that everything was one like monolithic substrate of water and volcanoes? Like the world isn't like that today. Like we have regions that have certain geological activities that other regions don't. So, I think that you're making yet another assumption that you're just simply not going to be able to defend. And when we look at the world, today or even in the past, I don't think that it even makes sense why you would say that anyway. You can have volcanoes over here and fountains over there, right? I mean, that's not some fringe thing to say, is it?
Where is the evidence that the fountains of the Great Deep were cracked open? Most people will say, well, it's the fault lines. The fault lines are where the most amount of volcanic activity are. So that's a catch-22.
Well,
What is it?
Today.
So where was the volcanic activity that you have recorded in antiquity? Because there is records of volcanoes going off. So that means there would be more fault lines. So we would see evidence of upwellings and upliftings.
Yeah.
Well, we have the mid-Atlantic ridge where you basically have that baseball seam pattern right around the Earth where the fountains of the Great Deep would have broken forth. I think that's pretty good evidence for the fountains of the Great Deep. Speak to that a little bit.
No, that's just a fault line. That's nothing to do with it breaking open.
Today.
It's the continents like a glove.
Today.
Literally.
I think there's a...
T-Rock gave a fantastic presentation right from Google Earth showing all those fault lines and how they run around the Earth in a baseball seam fashion, if I remember correctly, T-Rock.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how the secular scientists determined that the continent broke apart at some point in the past.
Here, well, that wasn't the only point of evidence, but so the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and other mid-ocean ridges like that, what Beamsy's trying to say is they're not vents. They are basically seams where the ocean floor is splitting apart.
Right, that's basically where we're saying
pumped anything out.
So, real quick then, we've got volcanoes all over the world, and they're notorious for spewing steam everywhere. Why would the Mid-Atlantic Ridge be different than that?
So they do spew steam, but they spew out a lot of other things as well. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, like I said, it's not a volcano. It's not a pump. It is literally a seam where the oceanic crust is being torn apart.
It's not a volcano, but it's exactly what a volcano would do if it wasn't forced into a very thin pipe.
Yeah, look, imagine looking at a depleted ball on the ground today and say, look, it's, there's with a rip in it. Say, well, it's just a seam. There's nothing coming out. Well, now there's not, right?
That's kind of analogous to slicing your tire with a great big wide cut gash through your tire. You instantly dump tons of pressure, but the volcanoes are small pinholes of essentially the same thing.
Yeah, and then
we understand that we have evidence for these hydrothermal vents that are found all over the ocean, including the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, Arctic oceans. These exist all over the planet.
Here, maybe I can explain that quick. Actually, Donny, I'm sharing something, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh yeah.
If you could pop it up. Okay. So here are how these hydrothermal vents work, and we know how these work because this is the exact same mechanism that like hot springs and geysers in Yellowstone do. So basically, groundwater, quote unquote, is absorbed by the oceanic crust and it goes downward. As it goes downward, it's heated up by magma that's pretty close to the surface. And then all that heat makes the water move upwards. As more and more water moves upwards, it slowly carves out channels in the rock, which eventually lead to a hole in the surface through which the hot water escapes.
Okay, so
and deposits minerals outside. It just
can you
keeps
back
growing.
up for just a minute, Doc? You
Yeah.
said something that was kind of interesting. You said groundwater goes down.
Well, it's absorbed. Yeah.
Okay, so absorbed downward, right?
Well,
I mean,
the source
the
of
fact you call it
groundwater is the ocean.
groundwater, the fact that you call it groundwater implies to me that you're talking about essentially rain and runoff and that sort of thing.
No, I'm using groundwater as a colloquial term. It's water from the ocean that's absorbed by oceanic sediments.
Are you saying
the
it's
sand at the bottom of the
absorbed
ocean is
laterally
wet?
through the? Are you saying it's absorbed laterally through the rock strata?
Not exactly at first. This is showing a developed black smoker or hydrothermal vent. The initial process is basically just the water going down, getting heated, and moving up.
So
over time, the water flowing upwards carves channels that usually converge into several hydrothermal vents.
Okay, so I'm looking at your diagram here, and it's kind of interesting because you've got 100% of the water coming from the ocean reservoir, from the ocean itself, right?
That would be where water comes from.
Well, Beamsy used an interesting word a little while ago. He said something about an aquifer.
No, I said artesian basin.
Okay, artesian basin. Where's the artesian basin in this diagram?
You're looking at it.
Well, no, because what I was describing that triggered him to say that was water literally coming up out of the ocean floor.
No, I asked you, is that what you were referring to?
But we literally have freshwater springs coming out of the ocean floor, not what you're describing here.
I'm not sure coming out of the ocean, but we do have freshwater springs. Yes, most of them follow a similar principle.
Yes, coming out of the ocean floor. We have fresh water coming out of the ocean floor.
I mean, not sure I would call it fresh. It's usually loaded with sediments. Let me see if I can find that.
Well, I certainly wouldn't drink it.
It's loaded with like hydrogen
Okay,
sulfide.
apparently they can occur, but it's very rare.
And
Most of these hydrothermal vents are just seawater plus minerals they've collected.
And George Bond here points out there's an estimated 100,000 to 1 million subterranean volcanoes, as per the secular sources.
I mean,
Okay,
I wouldn't doubt it.
I've got a point that kind of is totally unrelated to this. It was about like 30 minutes ago, but mind if I say that real quick?
Jackson, you are one of the stars of tonight's
right.
show. So you jump in anytime, my man.
All right. Okay. So I'll ask this to Donny. Donny, you believe there was like one pair of penguins for the penguin kind on the Ark?
Well, it's going to depend on clean versus unclean. So,
Right.
7 pairs of some, 2 of others.
Okay, let's assume it was 2.
Yeah.
Or maybe
yeah,
it was
with
7.
penguins too. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
hold on. Just to be like really precise, it doesn't necessarily need to be a penguin. A penguin could be derivative of the kind that was on the Ark.
Right.
So it's possible that a penguin was not even something that existed at the time. It would have just been that alpha Ark. Or
Right.
I don't believe there would have been a penguin on the Ark. The penguin we see today in its Arctic environment is an adapted form of whatever that archetype was on the Ark.
Okay, that kind of compounds the issue because penguins today have twice the genetic diversity of humans, and there were 3 pairs of humans on the Ark, or 4,
Jackson,
depending on how you count it.
One more caveat real quick for you. I honestly don't know the answer to whether penguins are clean or not, but for clean animals, there's a real important little caveat that's hardly ever mentioned. You've heard people talk about 7 pairs of clean animals, right? But probably most or all, or at least a bunch of the clean animals, a male was sacrificed after the ark landed. So what that means is for clean animals, you would have 6 breeding males and 7 breeding females, 13 total.
Okay.
But now here's the thing. When it comes to diversity, we'd expect animals today, like a penguin, like a chimpanzee, you name it, a wolf, to have more levels of genetic diversity than humans, because we're going back to the creation event, right? God creates 2 people, Adam and Eve. What does that do? Well, right off the bat, that restricts levels of genetic diversity. You're not going to have a whole lot of genes floating around a population of 2. And so today, the levels of genetic variation we see in humans matches that expectation. We have humans with low variation. But when it comes to animals, God didn't just create 2 or 7 or 14. No, he created animals in bulk, in populations, in fully functioning and working ecosystems. Now, yes, we do have a bottleneck at the flood. But remember what I pointed out earlier, Jackson, that bottleneck was a 1-generation bottleneck, followed up by rapid and exponential population growth. And so very little of that original created heterozygosity would have been lost in your animal kinds. And so whatever that archetype was that the penguin descends from, basically, okay, there would have been rapid and exponential population growth where it still would have retained enough diversity to have more than what humans have today. Does that answer your question?
I don't see how that makes sense, because you're getting all the descendants from 3 pairs. How is it producing more genetic diversity from the 3 pairs? And then you have, like, what we think maybe there was a global bottleneck of a couple thousand sometime in the past over a longer period. But wouldn't that, it just seems to me there would be more genetic diversity in that.
No, because it's going to depend on many things. It's going to depend on even how you define allele. Right? A genetic variant within a specific genetic loci. We have millions of genetic loci in the genome, and so millions of positions in the genome that have diversity. The point is, animals would have had more diversity in the pre-flood world. God would logically, and therefore likely, tell me if you agree with this, Sam, bring the most heterozygous or healthy animals to represent archetypes on the ark. And so whatever that archetype was that penguins descend from, ultimately, that would have right off the bat had more diversity in its genome, even if there's only 2, than Noah, his wife, and their 3 kids and their 3 wives would have had. And so from there, you have mutations, recombination, you have migration, all of your typical factors that go into speciation. And so today, according to you, I'm just, for sake of I didn't look into it, but for sake of argument, say penguins do have 3 times the amount of diversity humans have. That would be expected because its ancestor would have had more variation than the humans that came off the ark. Does that help?
Let me jump in real quick on that. There's a really important distinction between the creation model and evolution that is never mentioned by the evolutionists. And that is when you have a really small population, whether you're talking about 1 breeding pair or 3 breeding pairs, it doesn't matter. When you have really small populations like that in an empty world, they divide out very quickly into small subpopulations that become independent of each other very quickly. And so it's super easy to me to understand that a big portion of the genome does mutate very quickly. Animals typically, or commonly, I'll put it that way, animals commonly have more chromosomes than humans. And so they have more built-in diversity probably than most humans do because of the number of chromosomes. And so when you have all these small populations branching off very rapidly, it's super easy to get the number of species that we see today for any given land animal and the genetic diversity.
Go ahead, Jackson.
I don't really have a response. I see in the private chat, they're still talking about volcanoes. So I think.
Well, let me say this then. Let me say this then. With what T-Rock said, he nailed it. Because again, this bottleneck at the flood was a 1-generation bottleneck followed by rapid and exponential growth. As a matter of fact, all of your biblical bottlenecks, whether it's the creation event with Adam and Eve, the flood event, and then the Tower of Babel dispersal, they were all very short-lived bottlenecks. Okay. And so when you have, as T-Rock said, a rapidly growing population of pick your animal, pick your favorite animal. Okay, let's say the penguin archetype. You can have this population rapidly growing, diversifying, daughter populations basically forming, isolating themselves, accumulating their own independent mutations. And then that independent group is going to diverge more from the parent population, so you can get a lot of diversity that way in just 4,500 years. But if that animal started off with more diversity in the first place than humans, then yes, we'd expect them to have more diversity today than humans do overall.
So one more really important point there too is, like, if you take an animal like a rabbit that I know is unclean, so you only have 2 rabbits to start with. Now that's not to say there can't be more than one rabbit archetype, but typically the way I think of it, there's 2 rabbits on the ark. But anyway, another really important point that's always overlooked: evolutionists tend to think of wildlife, number one, as always managing itself out there, independent of human interference, number one. Number two, people selectively, I'll say it's a behavior behaviorally chosen. We make behavior-based choices, is the way I put it. Behavior-based choices. What that means is you'll have a couple people that really like the warm weather, so they'll head south to Florida. You have other people that really like the cold weather, so they go north. Animals do the same thing. And so if you have 2 rabbits starting out and they turn into a population of 10, 15, 20, whatever, and a small group of them prefers the warm weather just like people do, and a small group of them prefer the cold weather just like people do, then these populations are going to become separate very quickly, and they're going to start mutating independently of each other.
Right. And go ahead. Yeah. Someone from the evolution side, to be fair, feel free to speak.
I just wanted to put a pin in the hydrothermal vent thing, but it can wait.
Yeah.
I don't really.
And Doc and I know Doc and Jackson, to be fair, also wanted to talk about human evolution and hominins soon. So we'll get to that real shortly. But I did want to point out one thing that's important too, in terms of these adaptive episodes and how your archetypes, basically from that pre-existing diversity or ability to adapt, can evolve in just a few thousand years into all the species today, is the world of epigenetics, this extra layer of sophisticated information on top of the genetic code, basically, where sections of our DNA can be tagged with a methyl group, right, carbon atoms, that actually allows the cell to turn a gene on or off. We have millions of genetic switches in our genome just waiting to be turned on or off, depending on the environment. And so depending on your environment, you can grow taller, you can grow shorter, you can have thicker hair, you can have thinner hair. And so ever-changing environments, which is what we would have after the flood, requires ever-changing genomes. And so ever-changing genomes, in light of the post-flood environmental conditions, can explain all of the variations that we see today.
Was that for me?
Yeah, and I was looking at the chat. Paleologa said, you need to just use the obvious pun and say archetypes, right? Yeah. We need to get Brandon, our design guy, to copyright that somehow. Archetype, but ARK, maybe some cool design, cool logo. There we go. We heard it today. So yeah, Jackson, go ahead. And then T-Rock, for sure, stick around, because I have a feeling we're going to get into a little bit of how the fossil record organizes itself. And T-Rock has an active research program on that. And he's going to be unveiling a lot of that research next month in his own open mic. So T-Rock's going to be the star of the show. Anyways, with that plug out of the way, Jackson, go ahead.
I kind of forgot my train of thought, to be honest with you. I'm getting kind of tired. But
we do that to you,
I
don't
think
we, Jackson?
we should move to the hominid fossil record.
Sorry, really quick before then.
Or Doc, no, say something.
Okay, so for the freshwater springs in the ocean, looked it up. Those usually occur near the coast where the freshwater is sourced from an inland aquifer. So that's it. They're basically the same springs you see on land. They just occur in the ocean.
So what you're saying then is that because Beamsy, what he was describing a little while ago was water trapped in the rocks above the continental crust. And what you're saying alludes to this idea that water above the crust somehow gets forced down through and coming out laterally into the ocean floor.
It's pretty well understood. That's just how aquifers do things. Like you have a rock layer that can absorb water and transmit the water. It's going to absorb the water, and the water usually follows gravity through the layer. Since the layer is bent, the water goes down. It happens. Does that make sense?
I mean, my whole background has a lot more to do with mechanical engineering and physics. So yeah, it makes sense to me that you can have pressure from above push down and force something out that way. But you got to wonder how it is that we have water gushing out of the continents and gushing out the ocean floors.
I explained that.
For millions of years, no doubt.
You'll find most of the ones that are coming out on the continents are near mountains that have snow on top of them.
Okay.
Sure. Unless you live in the Midwest like me.
I want to ask one question related to this topic, the heat problem, and then I wanted to move specifically into some of the fossils, because I feel, Jackson, you did spend a lot of time on fossils and transitional fossils and the ordering of the fossils. And I know we all love to discuss hominins, so I wouldn't mind getting into that very shortly. And then T-Rock, we could even get your input on the ordering of the fossils. But in terms of the heat problem, would the evolutionists at least agree that in light of the research being done in the rapid production or formation of oil and coal, that in a lab using the right amount of heat, the right amount of pressure, we can actually form coal specifically in days to weeks? And so if at least portions of this heat produced from the flood could be utilized to rapidly form the massive amounts of coal, the massive amounts of oil and natural gas that we see today, essentially your pre-flood world could have acted as a sort of battery to absorb or utilize a lot of that heat generated at the flood. Because, and here's my main point, I see a lot of old earth creationists, a lot of evolutionists say there's just too much coal, oil, and natural gas for creationists to explain in just 4,500 years. But wait a minute. At the same time, you're pointing out that there's too much heat produced at the flood, heat and energy. So can't that heat and energy be used as a solution for the problem that you say we have with your coal, with your oil, with your natural gas? I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, Donny, you said a lot there. Could you maybe boil it down to 1 or 2 points we can take at a time?
Okay, so basically in one sentence, can the heat, at least parts of it from the flood, be used to produce coal, oil, and natural gas?
Yeah, Donny, use some of that heat to boil it down a little bit.
I think actually Beamsy would have the best answer on this. Beamsy, would the heat, would it do that? And
you want to phone
some of that mass on Earth to absorb the heat?
You're going to phone a friend?
The first problem would actually be, where would you actually get all the organic material to create the sheer size of the deposits?
I mean, the pre-flood world would have been 90% green. We see in the fossil record massive amounts of plant life. We see massive amounts of just creatures in all these different layers, terrestrial creatures that could be utilized as well. So, I mean, tons of plant and organic material in the pre-flood world to be used in combination with the heat and energy to form coal, oil, and natural gas. You know, that's my answer, I guess.
So
Yeah, not only that, I would double down and I would pose that question to the critics, because you're going to have to answer that question also. Where did you get all of that material? And then if you're going to suggest that it existed on the earth for these vast amounts of time, we're going to ask where all the bioturbation is. So I think those coal beds are a problem for you guys.
they're a huge problem.
I
with
mean,
all the
first, there's
carbon
bioturbation everywhere.
No, it's not actually within, like, especially, you know, like for the Grand Canyon, for example, you can't have distinct sharp boundaries and bioturbation.
So
I mean, if you go to bbc.com and just look at how fossil fuels are formed, they'll say over millions of years from the remains of lots of dead organisms, dead trees, and plant material. I mean, that's exactly what the pre-flood world would have comprised. A lot of dead organisms, a lot of plant material, and a lot of trees and other organic material to turn into coal, oil, and natural gas. Go ahead, T-Rock. You're going to say something.
Doc, is your background also geology?
Paleontology, but
Paleontology.
basically.
Okay, good enough. Anyway, so I live in Oklahoma, and they did something pretty interesting here recently. They cut. Uh-oh. Are you guys there?
There it is, boys. There it is. The debate of our lifetimes.
There you
Coming up.
Coming up, we got some good stuff to talk about. But yeah, I live in Oklahoma, and they did something here recently. They cut a new highway through a path. Actually went through a couple of hills and then cut down across a riverbed. And anyway, it's up in the hills that it's not a real tall hill or anything, but it's distinctly at a higher elevation than the riverbed. And so it's a pretty sharp contrast, the drop that you do. But anyway, in this hill, because they cut through an existing hill, one of the things that's exposed there, you can drive right past it. It's a town called Owasso, Oklahoma. You can drive through this highway and you can see a coal seam actually running horizontally through this hill cap. And like Sam's was describing, very distinct boundary below it and above it, very sharp boundaries. And it's up at the top of the hill. So when you look at that stuff, it just screams not slow processes. Where did that much compact vegetation come from to make a coal seam in the top cap of a hill?
I mean, it wasn't always the top cap of a hill. There would have been sediments above it in the past.
But you guys' process is to slowly deposit that stuff over really long periods of time. And hills don't just sit there in place. They're subject to erosion. So you're basically begging the question, how do you get these really distinct flat boundaries with a really slow process? And like Sam said, no bioturbation at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that gives you a flat boundary is going to be gravity. Almost all sediments deposit in flat layers.
Gravity also gives you
in the background, my cat is being a thing. Sorry, what?
Gravity also gives you erosion, but the only thing that really gives you flat parallel layers is moving water. It's the only thing known to actually do that for significant
it can happen
distances.
in sand dunes as well. It can happen in swamps. Actually, more likely to happen in swamps. No, it happens everywhere.
We're talking about marine deposits here.
Oh yeah, especially out in the ocean. Yeah, almost all flat.
So
moving
the problem,
water.
Yeah.
Not at the bottom of the ocean, at least for the most part.
Yeah, there are thermal currents in the bottom of the ocean.
Okay.
So, gentlemen, why don't we, now that we've spent a solid 2 hours on the heat problem, geology, and those related topics. Why don't we move specifically to fossils and back to more so the evidence for evolution topic? We could talk about the geology and heat problem side of things forever, though. But since we're at the 4-hour mark, might be good to transition to something that I know our star of tonight, Jackson Rowe, wants to chat about. I'll open it up with Naledi because I've been fascinated with Naledi since all the in-house, Doc, I'm sure you're aware of it, the in-house debate in the paleoanthropological community with Lee Berger. And I've listened to several interviews and lectures from Lee Berger recently, basically supporting his position and conclusions on Naledi being a very sophisticated people group. You know, the evidence that they're finding in the D. Naledi chamber within the Rising Star Cave system suggests that they could make fire. They buried their dead in a way that suggests spirituality. They have evidence for cave art and drawings that when you compare to Neanderthal cave art and drawings are very similar, almost the same, suggesting an intelligent people group. But I've got a presentation here comparing Naledi's hand to a modern human hand, comparing Naledi's foot, as you can see here, to a human foot. And everything about Naledi suggests that it's not transitional or pre-human or primitive in any way. It is a fully human people group. Any thoughts, gentlemen?
Yeah, I know Naledi's fairly recent, like what, 200,000 years ago, something like that?
Yeah, dates range because the dates aren't the most reliable currently. Even Lee Berger is being criticized because he's making some of his claims without having really reliable carbon dates currently on Naledi.
Not carbon dates, but there's a lot of things about the paper. It's honestly not a very good paper.
I think it's a pretty strong paper. If I remember correctly, it's a series of papers.
He's written a couple, but
what's a series of papers criticizing
the details, but there are a lot of critiques on the paper. But
there's also been responses from, like, I just want to point this out. I would recommend watching his latest interviews where he does defend his conclusions, his work. And he does point out that it's just a few dissenting opinions in the greater world of paleoanthropology. And he finds the arguments to be rather weak. Again, if you just look up a picture of the cave art or drawings that Naledi is supposed to have done, and there's no evidence of Homo sapiens. Okay, well, I would argue that Homo Naledi is Homo sapiens, just a degenerate form. But in paleoanthropological lingo, there's no evidence for Homo sapiens in that cave to be the ones to create the cave art. But yeah, there's a picture of the Naledi cave art next to a Neanderthal cave art. We would all agree that Neanderthal was an intelligent people group. It's the same. It's the same thing. So why is Neanderthal's legit cave art, but Naledi's isn't?
Well, it might be. I honestly haven't looked into Homo naledi that much. I'm more interested in like the older ones, like the Australopithecines.
So, Jackson, I got a question for you, real quick.
Yeah.
Since this is your one of your favorite things, is Naledi supposed to be ancestral to modern humans?
No, it's not.
No.
A side branch, then?
Yeah.
And why is that?
They lived way too recently. That's the main reason.
So now here's the main point I want to make is when it comes to the hominins, and yes, your Australopithecines, Jackson, would fall within that group. Okay, your Australopithecines would be hominins. Soon we'll get into the ordering of the fossils like you were talking about with Kent. I'd like to get into, in more detail, burial by communities, where you can basically take the so-called geologic column and turn it on its side horizontally. And when you look at it that way, you see, burial by community after community after community that is not communities over time, but communities living at the same time, but living in different areas. Okay, so we'll get into that. I know T-Rock's going to want to speak to that. But my point on Naledi is you get, like Doc, holding to common descent, many in the paleoanthropological world that'll look to atypical features associated with Naledi, associated with Floresiensis, Luzonensis, Erectus, just to name a few of your so-called pre-humans. But what we have here are examples of highly isolated, highly inbred, and highly degenerate people groups. And this can be supported by the conventional literature. Here's Professor Chris Stringer. Okay, he's not a young earth creationist, but he points out that this is not surprising that we see these isolated people groups and these atypical features associated with them because of the conditions that they existed in. For example, your islanders, subject to island dwarfism, subject to reductive evolution or reductive adaptation. So the final thing I'll say, and then Jackson, Doc, whoever, speak as long as you want, is your atypical features or your anomalous features that evolutionists want to say are primitive or basal or, not derived meaning more human-like, are not due to evolutionary change, but due to inbreeding, severe founder effects, pathology, and degeneration.
I mean, you can make that argument with Luzonensis and Floresiensis. They lived pretty recently, and they probably descended from Homo erectus, but you can't really make that argument with Homo erectus.
Sure you can. Erectus lived, and you can find this information in the paleoanthropological community. They existed in small tribes, less than 100. Some say 50. They existed in isolation. We talk as if there's evidence that Erectus lived on the globe for 1 million years. That's the story. But did you know, Jackson, every single fossil associated with Erectus can be fit in the back of a trunk of a car? And so the evidence I believe we have for Erectus is independent tribes that existed in under 100
Donny,
people.
Can you give me a source for that? That does not sound right at all.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more Homo erectus material than that.
We have tons of Homo erectus.
You think that we have more Homo erectus material that could fit in a trunk of a car?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay, well, you know what? We can verify that after the fact. Regardless, okay, Erectus and the paleoanthropological community has pointed out that they've existed in tribes, they've existed as hunter-gatherers, and they existed in numbers that were less than 100. And some of the different groups didn't even meet with each other. And so there was no gene flow between different groups. The gene flow seems to have comprised within the isolated groups. And so we understand that groups that remain isolated for a long enough period of time always show evidence of inbreeding. And then eventually what happens is those atypical features, they become fixed in that whole group. They become stuck in place where all members of that group have those features. Go ahead, speak to that a bit.
So another quick question while you're at it, when you respond, Jackson or Doc, either one. Homo erectus is in the modern human line, correct?
Yes.
Yes. But,
okay, go ahead and respond to Donny's deal, and then I've got another question.
Sorry, really quick. So just on the island of Java, so in Indonesia, I think, we have over 80 Homo erectus just on that one island.
80 Homo erectus bone fragments or complete skeletons?
It says individuals.
Yeah, but individuals in the world of paleoanthropology means one bone fragment.
Right, but these things range from Africa all the way to Indonesia.
Not individual.
Pardon?
These things range from Africa to Indonesia.
Yeah, because from Africa to Indonesia,
right? But
okay, you have
more material.
You have small tribes that I would argue are probably somewhere between 50 and 100 individuals, maybe in some cases 200. They're living independently from each other, and the gene flow is within each independent group. And so over time, you have almost certainly inbreeding and pathology and degeneration, and these features drift or shift to the norm. They drift to fixation, would be my point.
Doc, did you
So-
just correct that and say specimens and not individuals?
Oh, I was
Did I hear
saying,
that?
like, individual bones are classified as specimens. Individuals are from
Yeah.
individual.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that they have 80 bones or 80 complete structures?
So, okay. So if I found a skull, a jaw, and an arm bone, that were from one individual, they would still be 3 specimens. So I'm saying we have over 80 individuals.
Okay. But the examples we have of these individuals, I would argue, is evidence of them existing in isolation, existing as a highly inbred tribe or group. And notice all of these different so-called pre-humans here on the slide. Neanderthals, they lived in small, highly inbred groups. That's not even contested. In the harsh climate of glacial Europe, we understand environment can dictate morphology. Naledi lived among the caves of the South African wilderness. It appears that Naledi lived in a mosaic environment, actually. And mosaic environments would dictate a mosaic morphology, and that's what we find. Hobbit lived in the remote Indonesian island of Flores, isolated as well. And so the point is, each of these settings would lead to exactly what I said: founder effects, isolation, inbreeding, and anomalous features that become fixed in each group. And so I'd argue these are not evidence of pre-humans. These are not primitive features. These are evidence of a normal population that has become degenerate. Go ahead, gentlemen.
I've got a quick question for Doc and Jackson. When you look at the morphology of Homo erectus and you look at the morphology of a modern human, and to be clear, I'm not asking how long did it take. I'm asking how long should it take under, I'll use the phrase lightly, ideal circumstances. How long should it take for Homo erectus to evolve into a modern human?
Well, they didn't evolve into modern humans.
You said they were in the human line, though, right?
No, that's Homo erectus.
That's what I mean.
He's-
Homo erectus. How long should it take Homo erectus to evolve into modern humans under ideal circumstances?
So I'm going to take this one. It's really hard to say how long it should take. Like that's just really hard to say. We
Can
can't
you give high and low numbers then?
or from, let's say, the average Homo erectus to the average Homo sapiens. It could be anywhere from, depending on the selection pressures, anywhere from between 5,000 years to 500,000 years. Like,
Selection pressure?
evolution isn't usually that easy to predict.
Sorry, that is such a weird way to respond to that. Selection pressure?
Actually, T-Rock, I want you to respond, brother. I just wanted to really clarify. I think the full skeleton you'd be referring to with erectus, Doc, is Turcanoboy, but the rest are mostly scraps. They're mostly fragments. And so when you just compile all of those scraps and fragments of however many individuals they represent, you can fit those into the back of a large car. But there's not a whole lot associated with erectus, certainly not enough to say that erectus lived on the globe for 1 million plus years. Think about it. If their generation time was 20 to 25 years, like us roughly, okay, but existed for 1 million years, we should find billions of erectus fragments and certainly more than just one full skeleton, Turcanoboy. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's not accurate. Fossilization is an incredibly rare process. It's remarkable we have as many specimens.
It's a catastrophe most of the time.
Right, but it's an
No, it
argument from
doesn't.
but it's an argument from silence. You're saying, well, the reason we don't have all this evidence for erectus living on the globe for 1 million years and having all this children and existing in these large populations is because fossilization is very rare. Well, you don't have the evidence then. The evidence suggests that we had erectus type humans with distinct morphology existing in small tribes in different parts of the globe. They were inbred, they were subject to founder effects, and they were pathological. better
So-
support for the biblical creation model, not the deep time evolutionary model.